This week, an indifferent and for the most part ambivalent public were informed that David Cameron would not be seeking a third term as Prime Minister. Despite some of the mainstream media referring to such news as a revelation, the muted response it met was instructive as to how most people view Cameron's government and party politics more generally in 21st century Britain. Here was a Westminster village, journalists and politicians hand in hand, desperate to depict themselves as relevant ahead of a general election now less than 2 months away. But what will we remember when we look back at Cameron's first and potentially only premiership? Here are 3 things the 2010 to 15 government will likely be remembered for. Number 1, economic failure. Healthy GDP data in the last year has led to Cameron and his Chancellor George Osborne repeatedly parroting the metaphor that they're now fixing the roof while the sun is shining. But unless you think fixing the roof means presiding over falling real incomes, as well as relatively untouched trade and budget deficits, then such talk is obviously nonsense. The truth is that while much of the mainstream media have been eager to talk about the things the Chancellor's press office wants them to, the budget deficit for 2014-15 will be over £90 billion, more or less the same as it was the year before. That tells us 2 things. Not only have the government dramatically failed in their efforts to eliminate the deficit before 2015, as originally planned, but that whoever comes to power after May will have to preside over far bigger cuts and wage repression in the public sector than anything we've seen so far. Number 2, gay marriage. A key component of the Cameron project was that he represented a new kind of conservative. Even now, precisely what that means remains unclear, but it can perhaps be best understood as triangulating retrogressive policies on tax, housing and education with certain cherry-picked issues. In the case of Cameron's Tories, gay marriage and ring-fencing the budget on foreign aid and development. Now, don't get me wrong, it's great that anybody can marry anybody else that they want to, but one can't help but suspect that the policy was only ever pursued with such vigour precisely because it mitigated retrogressive measures elsewhere. Sure, we tripled tuition fees, but we're progressives. Over 900,000 people using food banks? Okay, but we're progressives. Benefit sanctions for people who have heart attacks while undergoing a work capability assessment. Look at gay marriage, we're progressives. I'd expect another policy to perform a similar role in their forthcoming election manifesto, so keep your eyes peeled ahead of May. Number 3, riots. On November 10, 2010, 54 arrests were made at Millbank Tower, headquarters of the Conservative Party, after a deviation from an NUS demonstration against proposed reforms to higher education. 220 police officers had been deployed for that protest, a number that was found to be wanting as events unfolded. A year later, almost precisely to the day, and another demonstration in relation to more or less the same set of grievances took place. This time, however, a demonstration of 7,000 to 8,000 was faced with 4,000 police officers. The difference in the number of cops deployed between these 2 dates being instructive as to what took place on the streets during the first 18 months of the coalition government. Indeed, it's easy to forget amid another housing bubble that period saw a level of street protest and industrial action which hadn't been experienced in Britain for several decades. The last several months of 2010 saw several large student riots in London and elsewhere. On March 26 the following year saw perhaps the biggest black bloc in Britain ever. And meanwhile, the following August, sandwiched between industrial action in June and November, were the English riots, initially triggered by the police execution of Mark Duggan, but harder to untie from larger dynamics of racist policing and numerous economic grievances which strike both race and class. The response to all of this was more or less what the students saw that November. Heavy, punitive sentencing in the courts, a show of force by London's biggest gang, the Metropolitan Police Service, and the complete dissolution, not that it ever really existed of course, of policing by consent. Do they expect more of this in the next 5 years? One can only presume the answer to that is yes, since Mayor Boris is so desperate to get his hands on several water cannon. That's what Cameron will really be remembered for. Economic failure, even by the metrics he sets himself, an enlightened policy which allowed him and his government to undertake so much barbarism elsewhere, and riots. Would you expect to see more of the same were he to be the Prime Minister for the next 5 years? Almost certainly. So what's your take on David, call me Dave, Cameron? And how will he be remembered? And are we really in for another 5 years of this posh muppet being interviewed by BBC journalists who look and or sound just like him? Comments below, always welcome of course, and you can share, like and do whatever you like with regards to this video on the hashtag on Twitter, hashtag IMO Bastani. Thanks for watching. Bye.